It's a pleasure today to introduce Her Excellency Mina Obermeier. She is the current ambassador of the European Union to New Zealand, and she's been in that position since November 2019. She has worked for the European Union since 2001, and she served as the advisor to the Deputy Chief Negotiator for the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. And she was the lead negotiator for issues related to Ireland at the European Commission in Brussels. She's also worked as Deputy Head of Division in the European External Action Service, and she was in charge of EU relations and negotiation with Switzerland. She's been Deputy Head of Unit at the European Commission in charge of protection and crisis management. And also between March 2003 and August 2009, she held subsequent positions as Desk Officer for Israel, the West Bank, Gaza. Prior to her positions at the European Union, she was a senior producer and journalist for ARD on German television, and she has an MA in European Studies from the College of Europe in Poland and an MA in Political Science and History from the University of Hanover in Germany. And she also speaks 4 languages: English, German, French, and Dutch. So please join me in welcoming Mina.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually I speak 6 languages, but I don't note them down because they're not good enough to actually give conferences in. I thought start with something topical. I'll speak about vaccines before I move into the EU's position on COVID recovery and how we're doing that, the famous Build Back Better, green and digital transition, before saying a couple of words on the EU's Green Deal, then going straight into the FTA negotiations, and before making the case for why the EU and New Zealand should be partners not only when it comes to trade negotiations and trade matters, where I think the focus lies too much. Every single New Zealander I meet explains to me New Zealand is a remote country at the bottom of the world that is export and trade dependent, and we will need market access for our beef and dairy, please, now. And I understand that. This is perfectly legitimate, and of course, a common objective that we're having. We'll have the next round of FTA negotiations in the last week of March, and both sides are committed to conclude these negotiations swiftly. But it's not all there is to say about EU-New Zealand relations, and I'll come to that when speaking about multilateralism and why the EU is actually the best example for a multilateral organization, and I'll try to give you some illustrations from the practical daily life interactions in Brussels and how the EU works. And of course, happy to answer any questions you may have, and also all Brexit-related questions, which is what I was doing before coming here, as Serena has explained. Starting with vaccines. And this is something that is dear to my heart because I feel the EU has been very unfairly treated, and in particular here in New Zealand, when we were accused to be vaccine nationalists. After the EU, at the end of January, on the 30th of January, decided on an export authorization regime for vaccines, which means that before any vaccines that are manufactured in Europe, in the EU, can be exported to a third country, an authorization will need to be sought. And immediately there were outcries of vaccine nationalism, export bans. That is not what happened. So I'll just take one step back and explain what happened. So the EU early on during the COVID crisis, so basically already in April last year, organized and co-hosted a massive pledging conference to fund the development and distribution of treatments and vaccines against COVID-19, and full of the conviction that vaccines and treatment are a global good and should be available to everybody independent of wealth. And we managed to attract billions. At the first pledging conference, we had more than 4.5 billion euros, and this is a rolling process, this keeps increasing. We've ourselves, and that's the EU alone, not including member states, pledged 1 billion for the COVAX facility, which will deliver vaccines to those countries that are less well off than EU member states. And we've invested 5 billion New Zealand dollars into the development and the upscaling of manufacturing capacities for vaccines in the EU. And this is where we come to the heart of the matter. So vaccines are produced, both the Pfizer-BioNTech and AstraZeneca are produced on EU territory. Now we've got a problem because both Pfizer and AstraZeneca have said, yeah, we know we signed an agreement with you that we would deliver you that many doses by that date, but sorry, can't make it. We can only give you 40% of what we signed up to deliver. And we thought, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel quite right. We paid 5 billion euros to make sure that these manufacturing capacities are there. And we paid you, even before the vaccine was authorized, to start the production already, so that by the time the authorization would be given, the vaccines could be quickly distributed. Now, we've got the COVID situation at the moment in Europe as it is. It's still pretty bad. We're, depending on where you look at, second or third wave. There's still roughly 2,000 new cases a day in Belgium alone. So my colleagues haven't been in the office since September. It's 10% of the colleagues are allowed to come into the office every day. In Germany, we've got 3,000 cases a day, so it's still pretty bad, and thousands of people are dying in Europe every time. Now, what we're doing is we're looking at every single export and are checking whether there is a so-called advanced purchase agreement. And then, mindful, of course, that countries such as Australia or New Zealand or Canada have concluded advanced purchase agreement, we look at whether there is such an agreement and for which amounts, and make sure that these are not vaccines that should have gone to our citizens. So you can call that vaccine nationalism if you think that's the right thing, but given that we've done this advance investment and that the situation is as bad as it is, and that up to now there have been more than 100 requests for authorization, and they have all been granted. We might have a first case where this isn't the case today, but in general, this was all granted because it was found to be in compliance with previous agreements. I think that is not fair. And one thing I should maybe also clarify in this regard is that this export authorization only applies to a very limited number of countries, that all the low and middle income countries are exempt from it. 92 countries are exempt from it, and all the deliveries of COVAX are, of course, also exempt. So, yeah, just to give you a bit of background on this discussion, hopefully in Q2 the situation will be much better. The export authorization regime is only applicable until the end of this month, when hopefully production capacities will have caught up, which means, again, it's not a ban. In the worst case, so in the case an authorization is not granted, it will mean a delay, just as European citizens are facing a delay in deliveries because of an insufficient upscaling of production capacity.
I saw this morning that EU and Italy blocked the export of the AstraZeneca vaccine to Australia. So do you think that it's likely to continue, like blocking exports if the deliveries aren't made to the EU first, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was the case I was referring to. we don't know yet what will happen. It's very early stages, so Italy has not granted the export authorization for these, I think it's 250,000 doses of vaccines. What will happen now is that the EU will talk to Australia, and one of the objectives of this regime is to ensure an equitable distribution of vaccines. So it might well be that we agree a schedule with Australia. I can't really speculate about what will happen next, but this is one of the instances, the first as far as I know, where there is an issue and where it is found that this could not be granted, this export authorization. Yeah. Okay, so that was a very positive preface, but let me move into COVID recovery and what the EU is doing on that. And I'll maybe dive right into the practicalities of Brussels policy making. COVID recovery, so a bit of a bumpy start at the beginning of COVID. Some of the EU member states that were particularly hard hit at the beginning of the crisis felt not sufficiently supported. Talking of Italy here and Spain. So the first couple of weeks, I think everybody in the world was very unprepared, unfortunately, for this pandemic. And some EU member states were particularly affected. But very quickly after the first quite terrible weeks, the EU got its act together and coordinated internally about the response. Organized bulk purchasing of personal protective equipment, also started already the purchasing process for the vaccines, and coordinated on border closures and what we do with travel coming in from outside the EU. And the health ministers exchanged what they were doing also on the restrictions of daily life on a daily basis. So that worked really well. And we also had this external dimension very early on in the process, notably to take care of those countries that didn't have the means to protect themselves. So we had air bridges to many countries in the world where we provided personal protective equipment and also medication to countries that were less well off than we were. At the same time, we had to decide about how we are going about the recovery of our economies. Because just as everywhere in the world, and this is something that was very much in the forefront, of course, also of the New Zealand electoral campaign, what do we do now that we've all got so much more debt? All the member states have got more debt, and that the economy is so hard hit and will be facing GDP losses, quite significant GDP losses. And also there, the EU found a common response. And that was quite remarkable, if not to say historic. So in July of last year, the 27 heads of state and government, they're also called the European Council, they meet in Brussels all the time. So in July they met to discuss COVID recovery and to discuss also the EU budget. The EU budget is always adopted for a period of 7 years. So we don't have annual budgets, we've got 7-year budgets. It's also called the multi-annual financial framework. And in addition to that, there was another proposal on the table, and that was a really novel proposal. It was later to be called Next Generation EU. But basically, it was common borrowing on behalf of the 27 member states. That has never been done before. So the 27 benefited from the fact that as EU, they had, of course, much better credit rating than individual member states to borrow 750 million euros on the capital market, which would be used for COVID recovery plans. I'm talking, of course, all in addition to the national budgets. Every member state still has their own budgets and does their own recovery plans. This is only European level I'm speaking about. So 750 million for that. And then the heads of state and government had to discuss the share of these 750 million that would be distributed as grants and what would be distributed as loans. And that was, of course, very controversial, as you might imagine, because some countries are paying more into the budget than they're getting out, and others are getting out more than they pay in. It's the net beneficiaries and the net contributors. And so these were long, long nights. Budget discussions are always long, long nights in Brussels, but this was a record-breaking summit. It was 4 days and 4 nights of discussions, and you could see the bleary-eyed heads of state and government that all gave their press conferences. That is actually something quite worthwhile looking at, because at the end of the, watching, at the end of every European Council, you've got simultaneous press conference of 27 member states. So they are all with their national press and are explaining the deal they've just concluded. And it's really entertaining sometimes and interesting to see where the different nuances are, because of course a net contributor would brief differently from a net beneficiary. Anyway, everybody could live with the result in the end, and it is quite an ambitious plan. So it's the foundation for building back better, because out of this next generation EU, 37% have to go to the fight against climate action. So every single member state that submits a plan on how to use the money that has been allocated in the form of grants or loans has to spell out this 37% that will go for the fight against climate action and for the transition to the digital economy as well, but mainly for the realization of the objective of the Green Deal. So we have clearly understood, and this is there, I'm speaking for the 27 heads of state and government, that this crisis, this pandemic, is of course a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to accelerate the transition. So it didn't change any of the priorities that the Commission and the EU had before, but has only reaffirmed the commitment. So the Green Deal remains at the center of the decision making, and as I said, 37% of this next generation EU will go to measures against climate change. And of the overall budget, which was also adopted after 4 days and 4 nights, 1.1 trillion euros. So in total, we're talking about 3 trillion New Zealand dollars that were agreed last July. Also of that, 30% will have to go to the fight against climate change. So a very clear commitment. And I said I would say something about the actual practicalities of this. One thing that's always the case in these budget negotiations, they get quite touchy, there are leaks, some people tweeting out of the room, there's a discussion in the room, there's a discussion outside of the room, there are discussions, and that's what every official is super afraid of, when only the heads of state are in the room, no advisors, nobody can listen in on what the deals are that they're striking. Then, because it's always several nights, you can already see some delegations are booking in the same hotel, and then there are these hotel bar conversations. So you have these alliances, and when it's getting really tricky, so when we're nearing the end of the negotiations, the president of the European Council, at the moment it's a Belgian, it's Charles Michel, he will invite the heads of state and government for the so-called confessional, one by one. So they all come in, and he then tries to find out or tease out from them what's their real bottom line. So what is it you'd be willing to accept? Where are the landing zones? So this is really an art, and it's quite interesting to see that the head of the European Council very frequently comes from a small member state, because small member states are much more experienced in deal-making and in mediating. So Belgians have a federal state. Of course, there's constant negotiation going on. That is always something that takes up quite a long time, and nobody walks out. This is, I think, one of the biggest things to remember in an EU context. You always meet again, and everybody knows that. And even when it gets very unfriendly in the room, normally it stays civil enough to be meeting a couple of hours later in the same room and to continue the discussion. Nobody walks away simply because that's the way the EU is set up. You win in one discussion and you lose in another, and nobody looks at it as a zero-sum game. It just overall, it's beneficial for everybody that's part of the club. So I think that is really important in terms of understanding the rationale of the EU, and that was also the case for the budget negotiations. As I said earlier, everybody in their national press conference could sell the result as a win. And now we're implementing this. So now we're implementing this. We've adopted all the legislative acts that follow from this. We've received the first national programs. We're now putting on track our new research program, the largest research program in the world, Horizon Europe. 95 billion euros for 7 years, so also massive. We'll be talking to New Zealand universities about cooperation, strengthened cooperation on this, but that's for another topic. And of course, this will help us to put in place everything that is needed to realize the Green Deal and our objective of making Europe a carbon neutral continent by 2050. We've also set as an interim target for 2030 a reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions as compared to 1990 by 55%. And what is happening at the moment is my colleagues, all from their homes with their toddlers around their feet, are drafting the legislation, the overhaul of all the legislation that supports the Green Deal and the transition to a green economy in Europe, notably as regards energy efficiency, as regards agricultural emissions, as regards housing renovation, as regards mobility, so transport solutions. All of this is now being overhauled with the objective of having by mid this year the full package that will be called Fit for 55 on the table, because of course we'll have to review everything that we've done in the past and make it even more ambitious in order to achieve that goal. And what we are doing with not only with this Fit for 55, but in general with this strong commitment, binding commitment to have roughly 1/3 of all expense for the benefit of a transition to the green economy, is to give certainty to businesses, which helps because now business can understand that now they will be getting money and support for transitioning into the green economy. Whereas if they wait now and don't take the decision, it'll only get more expensive later on. So there's a really strong incentive now to move into circular economy, into more energy efficiency, into the promotion of integrated energy systems, electric vehicles, you name it. So this policy really is across the board, and we're looking to build green alliances across the world. And it was very encouraging now to see that countries such as Japan and South Korea have also increased their targets, or rather, have increased their targets, their reduction targets for 2030, and even China has now committed to carbon neutrality by 2060, I think. It is a bit later than 2050, so which would require, I mean, without China, basically, it'll be very difficult to get there. So, yeah, very encouraging and very much hoping that we'll also see implementing steps from the New Zealand government after the legislative framework has been put in place last year, and now the discussion is going on about the recommendations of the Climate Change Commission to see how much of that government will pick up to make New Zealand fit for 2030 and then 2050. Okay, FTA. We started negotiating almost 3 years ago after a long scoping exercise. We'll now be starting round 10. It'll be the third virtual round. As you can all imagine, negotiating virtually is no fun. I've spent a lot of time in my life negotiating, and you've got the time in the room, and then you've got the time in the corridor, and then you've got the time over pizza at night when it's getting really late, and all this is not taking place. But the fortunate thing is that we started these negotiations, as I just said, already in 2018. So the negotiators know each other, and there already is a relationship, which means that although the negotiations are taking place virtually and at funny times. So just to give you an idea, it's 6 to 10 in the morning, and then it's 9 to 12 in the evening at the moment, New Zealand time, that we're negotiating. Progress could be made over the last 3 rounds. And I'm sure there will also be progress made now in this round 10 at the end of the month. We're now at a stage we've advanced really quickly with many chapters that we could close. But we're now at a stage where it gets tricky. And for those of you that have followed these negotiations more closely, last July, when our market access offer was put on the table, there was quite a strong reaction from the then trade minister that wasn't particularly pleased about the offer. So that is obviously one of the sticking points, how much New Zealand beef, dairy, and sheep meat will be able to enter the EU market at no or very low tariffs. So that's one. And on our side, we have a strong interest in getting our geographical indications also protected within New Zealand. Are you all familiar with that discussion? No, it's so we are very proud of our food heritage, and in particular, some of our member states. Most of the GIs, actually geographical indications in the EU, are from Italy and Spain. We've got a long tradition of producing, in accordance with authentic production methods, foodstuffs that are coming from a particular geographic region and subject to specific climatic or geographic conditions. So this exists for wine, also in New Zealand, for example. Champagne is one of the examples. You can only call a sparkling wine champagne if it is from the region of Champagne, produced in accordance with the traditional production method of champagne in France. But it's also true, for example, for San Daniele ham that comes from a little village in Italy where there's one down current, one wind that comes from a particular direction, and the pigs are fed with very particular foodstuffs, and the producers have said, look, this is something that is very special, and that goes back for centuries, and they've put themselves together and have applied for a geographical indication. Now they are all bound by the list of criteria they've themselves developed, and they can sell their San Daniele ham at a premium, because people now know if they buy San Daniele ham, they get this flavor. And we've got 2,200 of those across the EU. And it's part of all our free trade agreements. Without it, there's no free trade agreement. And it includes, of course, lots of wines and alcoholic drinks as well. And New Zealand already has a GI system for wines, and spirits, but not for foodstuffs. But why have I put the FTA at the end of what I was going to say? Because I think, as I said at the beginning, this is not all about trade. EU-New Zealand relations are about much more. And for a country that is a remote country at the bottom of the world, it is a multilateralist not only by choice, but also by necessity. Simply, a country of 5 million has difficulties surviving on its own, because only if it can be sure that commonly agreed rules are actually enforceable and are actually upheld, can it live in security and safety. So that is, of course, very important for the global rules-based trading system, but even more so for multilateralism in general, that you have a set of rules that a number of countries agree and make sure they're complied with. So, and I think there, after everything I've just explained, I don't think there should be any doubt that the EU is, of course, the prime partner to work together and to preserve multilateralist institutions, because who else is there, frankly? You've got the United States that has now come on board back on board after a period of quite an unpredictable administration over the last 4 years, so very happy. I think the sigh of relief that went through New Zealand was also heard across Europe, which is good. But what happened 2016 to 2020? who knows whether this something like that happens again? And otherwise, you've got an ever more assertive China. And in this context, we believe that it is more important than ever to have strong institutions that protect the world order as it was agreed, and to reform the institutions that we have, because nobody would pretend that the WHO, the WTO, the UN are perfect institutions, and this is where we are already working with New Zealand quite a lot on the reform of these institutions, and where we will continue. But we would be very happy to see that New Zealand regards the EU as the natural ally it is on the global stage, and this is part of my job here and my plea here to you and my pitch. And I think I'll just stop here and answer all the questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much.